Okay, so this is the third lecture in chapter 1 of psychology. Give me a second, set my timer so I don't talk too long. Okay, we left off, we were talking about, we were still up here in this little box about the 19th century. And I was discussing the Wilhelm Wundt is the founder, and then I moved on to his student, who is Edward Titchener. And Titchener is the fellow that's given credit for the phenomena or the process of introspection. And again, he assumed, or he used introspection as a method of understanding or measuring the structures, if you will, of consciousness. If that sounds abstract to you, it sounded abstract and impractical to a lot of other people too. And so introspection did not stick around very long, partly because it was difficult to use and sort of like, so what's the point? You know, I think I mentioned in the last video, if I gave you a piece of chocolate and I ask you to describe the sensation of the chocolate, so maybe you can describe it, but what's the point? I think he used, though, a bell, and he would ring a bell and ask his subjects to how long did it take before they became aware of that bell. And while that may be an interesting question, it's not a terribly useful question, and it became difficult. You couldn't train, psychologists like to use animal studies, and so it was impossible. You couldn't ask an animal to tell you when they became aware of a bell. Nor was it necessarily a useful strategy for people who were nonverbal or for children, so it didn't stick around very long. But this idea of introspection, this idea of mindfulness, of becoming aware of your thoughts, this is something that our culture talks about. Mindfulness, simply sitting with your thoughts, can be a very useful personal development skill. So the assignment that I associate with this chapter is one where you are invited to practice that. And the next time you're driving or mowing the grass, or maybe you're a meditator, you know, if we were together, I'd ask you, do you meditate? I do. I do a little bit of, well, in my faith tradition, we call it centering prayer, or yoga is a form of mindfulness, where for a few moments you just draw your attention inward. And sometimes we don't want to do this because we don't like the thoughts that are going on in our head. But the idea is that when these thoughts come, you just notice them and you let them go. And it sounds easy, but it's actually quite hard to do. Yeah, okay, so anyway, that was introspection. But the assignment I invite you to do is for like 20 minutes, and then you describe your experience. And I'll be perfectly honest, some students say, I can't do it. I can't sit there that long. 20 minutes is a really long time. There's research that says 20 minutes is how long it takes before you actually get the benefit of that sort of meditative experience, where your blood pressure slows down, your heart rate slows down, or your blood pressure decreases. But just use that as sort of a guideline, a ballpark. You may only be able to go out to do it for 5 minutes, or you may not be able to do it all. Or maybe you already do it every day, I don't know. And then we want to move on here to William James. William James was a student of Titchener. See how this works? And he is credited with an approach called functionalism. I believe he's mentioned in your textbook. And what William James was really more interested in was what was the function of consciousness, right? Where Titchener was trying to understand the structure of consciousness, James says, so what's consciousness for? And he acknowledged or recognized that there were various types of conscious awareness. From James' perspective, we are never unconscious. We are just in different states of consciousness. There's wakefulness, there's a sleep kind of consciousness, there's a dream consciousness, there's an intoxication consciousness, there's a when you space out. All of those are states of consciousness. But what James wanted to understand was, what purpose did they serve? What was the role of sleep? What was the role of a dream state of consciousness? So he asked the question about the function, right? The function of what is consciousness for? Why? Yeah, blah, 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 blah. Okay, Moving on to the next slide, let me make sure your textbook talks about, yeah, you got Freud. Freud is sort of the black sheep of the psychologist family. When I was taking my history of psychology class, I was like, oh, I've heard of this guy. And I looked around the room, and all the other psychology majors in the room were like, oh. So he's sort of like the rich uncle that you got to know a little bit about him because he was very powerful in the history of psychology, but he's not very much liked by psychologists. And so Freud, and what I want you to remember is that Freud continues to be very important to the field of psychology, primarily because of his, or in part, because of his contribution of psychoanalysis. So that will be a quiz question. How does Freud continue to influence the field of psychology today? And that's because of his role of psychoanalysis, where, yeah, and conventional therapy, like today, if you go to a therapist, they're still using remnants of psychoanalysis, though according to historians, Freud didn't like the intimacy of therapy, of psychoanalysis. So like today, if you go to a therapist, you're probably going to be at a level, you're probably going to be facing each other face to face, right? But when Freud was a therapist, he would have his patients lie down so they would be symbolically less than him and facing away. And historians tell us he didn't like the intimacy that went with. And he's discredited a little bit because all of his conclusions, all of his theories, his penis envy and his Electra complex theories were all derived from himself and from his patients, and that's considered kind of unethical. Some, not kind of, that's considered unethical. Some discredit him because apparently he was also a cocaine user, but at the time, cocaine was a completely legitimate substance. So I don't think that's a fair criticism. But psychoanalysis, and specifically have thoughts that are below your awareness, right? So you kind of got some of that James functionalism, thoughts that were below your awareness affect your behavior. And I would bet if I went around the electronic classroom and I asked you to raise your hands, I bet most of us can accept that as a truth, right? That sometimes we act in a way and we don't know why we act that way because, quote unquote, deep down, maybe we're angry or we're jealous or we're nervous, right? We attribute that to Freud, that these behaviors or these feelings, these beliefs at a deep level are what's causing us to act. And so he didn't actually believe in hypnosis, but by the process of psychoanalysis, you begin to ask yourself questions like, well, why do you think you feel that way? The criticism, and where Freud gets kind of wacky, is because he attributes so much of that to sex and to violence. Specifically, I think we'll get more to this later, but specifically his concept of penis envy was the notion that the reason women spend so much of their energy trying to get the attention of men is because they are aware that men have penises and they are envious of penises. So they want a penis, they envy them. He also assumed that it's a hard word, one begins with that there was a conflict, Oedipus conflict. Some of you probably, I'll write it down in another slide, but the conflict between adolescents and their other sex parents. So there would be a conflict between the teenage son, and his father, because the teenage son is jealous that his father is having sex with his mother. We leave that there. And the same thing would be true for girls and boys, is that a girl would be jealous of her mother because her mother is having sex with her father. And so he observed that you could see some of these traits in young children. So like a small child, and I don't know if you hang out with kids or small children or not, but you might hear a small, maybe a 6-year-old, a small boy saying that, you know, when he grows up, he's going to marry his mom. And Freud attributed that to these deep subconscious sexual desires. And some people find that problematic. But it was also sort of about violence. Okay, so I'm at my 10-minute mark. Again, those 10 minutes go by fast, and I'm going to stop this here. And when we come back, I want to talk about Watson's behavioralism and Maslow, and I got some pretty cool pictures of some